I'm Eliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered. I'm Eliot Chodoff, joined again and still by my good friend Zev Uslan. It's April 14th, 3:30 in the afternoon here in Israel. We are enjoying, so to speak, something of a ceasefire, although Hezbollah is still shooting. And we're going to deal with some more background kind of issues. So, first of all, Zev, welcome back again. Maybe I should stop welcoming you. You're part of the show now. How are you doing? What's up?
So this is what I'd like to talk about today, Eliot. On the heels of our last conversation where we went into depth about the cult and culture of Islamists and death. And I think the prerequisite to that is what I want to follow through, which is as an Israeli of 7 years, but of more years than I can count, an American, I'm in touch with a lot of American professionals. I think I've mentioned I'm a psychotherapist, work with many physicians, have a lot of friends and family, and have a lot of contact with patients who are not Jewish and other mental health professionals. And what constantly gets raised is a lack of understanding, not only the daily life of being in Israel in the middle of a war, but the context of what we're doing. And what came up in a specific case is names have been removed for protection of the innocent. A physician from Los Angeles, an endocrinologist I worked with for many, many years, a brilliant man, but a very thoughtful, kind man who views himself as trying to help people all the time. To that end, he volunteers at hospitals and medical clinics all over the world. And he listened to our third podcast, and he was appreciative of what we were saying, the difference in values and radicalism and extremism. But he ended the note by saying the following. He goes, was this an argument for rationalizing killing 73,000 Palestinians after 1,200 plus Jews were murdered? Now 2,039 Jews to date. This is more than an eye for an eye. And as a new Israeli, as you can imagine, my passions got very powerful. And many people said, just drop it. You don't want to get into this battle. It's a guy who doesn't understand. And I decided to take it on. And I wrote him a lengthy 3-page, single-spaced recovery with some of the following points. One is that over 10,000 missiles have been fired at us, that we've not gone into Gaza as a means of protecting our own troops and civilians. 3, that we go to great lengths, as justified by some experts, to protect lives, and that this is one small part of a massive attack on us from 8 fronts. And I, quote unquote, ripped him a new one. And I said, I don't want to hear from you again if you're going to continue maintaining this. And I think he put his foot in his mouth because later on he kind of apologized. But I think this is the very issue many Americans / Canadians / Westerners can't understand: the power, the intentionality. Now, as an American Jew, it's all about never again for me. But as a military person, what is your take on this? What do you think about not only what he said literally, but what he represents in terms of basically intelligent, good-hearted Westerners and Americans who don't get what we're trying to do and what we need to do?
When I hear this question, I hear 2 things. One is that we used October 7th as a rationalization for killing 70+ thousand Palestinians. I want to address that as issue number 1. And issue number 2, that it's beyond an eye for an eye which has essentially two elements built into it. One is that our response or our action against Hamas after October 7th was somehow in the category of punitive, because an eye for an eye is a category of punishment. And two, that it was somehow disproportionate because, once again, an eye for an eye and going beyond an eye for an eye has that element of, well, you overdid it. Let me start by saying that all of the points that you made, in other words, the factual response is absolutely correct. My issue is not the micro response, if you will, of the number of rockets and the number of attacks and so on and so forth, but rather with the macro. First of all, the idea that we used October 7th as an excuse, because rationalization has that kind of connotation, to go in and kill 70 plus thousand Palestinians, of course, undifferentiated. I know they were all women and children, not. And that somehow, when you compare 70,000 Palestinians to 1,200 Jews, or Israelis, because not everyone who was killed on the 7th was Jewish. Wow, what an overstep, what an overreach. It was really an excuse. So first of all, I think we have to take a couple of steps back, and I don't want to rehash the Muslim Brotherhood aspects of Hamas. We've talked about it, and we'll probably go into it again sometime in the future in some depth. But we have to keep in mind that Hamas's charter, which it calls the Covenant of Allah, before they cosmetically changed it, started with the words, Israel will exist until Islam obliterates it. And that's a quote from Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, the raison d'etre of Hamas is the destruction of Israel. This is not some random organization of resistance that happens to respond to certain Israeli actions. Their purpose is to destroy Israel and, incidentally, to wipe out the Jewish people. But I want to leave that now aside for a moment. We pulled out of Gaza, out of the Palestinian populated areas, in the wake of the Oslo Accords in the mid-1990s. In 2005, we withdrew the remaining Israeli citizens, so-called Gush Katif, plus other villages and the Israeli military, in what was referred to as the disengagement in August 2005. In other words, we left Gaza completely. Now, yes, I know we closed the border. We didn't close the Gaza border. We closed the Israeli border. And that was the state of affairs. Yes, we provided them with aid. We provided them with electricity. We provided them with all sorts of things. And along the way, they provided us by firing rockets at us. And from that disengagement of 2005 until 2023, we used the punitive method. I'm going to period there. I'll come back to that. After October 7th, we decided the punitive method does not work. Now, had we wanted to kill tens of thousands of Palestinians, we had 2 decades plus prior to do it. But we waited until they killed 1,200 Israelis to use it as a rationalization. There's something a little bit wrong with this argument. Unless you buy the argument that we let it happen intentionally in order to give them the excuse. And that we're going to deal with in an entirely different series of discussions. This was not and is not a punitive operation. It is a war. It's a war that they declared when they came into existence in 1987, and it's one that we've taken not terribly seriously until October 7th, 2023. And what I mean by that is we responded tit for tat all through the years, never saying we are going to defeat them. We're simply going to try to convince them not to do it again. Now, here we have to keep something in mind. Yes, punishment should be in some way measured. And that's the idea behind an eye for an eye. However, and this is true both in criminal punishment as well as in the use of punishment as a deterrence method, if you do not punish at a high enough level, you essentially are escalating, you're incentivizing the action that you're trying to stop. I'll give you a very simple example. If somebody robs a bank and gets $10,000 and you fine them $5,000, what you're basically saying to them is that it's worth $5,000 every time you rob the bank. This is not punitive, it's incentivizing. Punishment in any event has to be measured, but it has to cost more than it's worth. This was not punishment, however. This was a decision made by the Israeli government already on October 7th, that this is a war and it needs to be fought as a war. And I think the simplest and most direct parallel is what happened in World War II. It's the simplest analogy. Look at what the United States did to Japan for that piddly little attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, after all, let's be honest. What did the Japanese do on December 7th, 1941? They attacked Pearl Harbor. They sank a few obsolete battleships, most of which were raised and put back into service. They killed a couple of thousand Americans. All right, so they did. They destroyed some airplanes. And for that, America dropped nuclear weapons on 2 Japanese cities, sank their entire navy, destroyed their entire air capability, bombed their cities, took their colonies, cut off their resources. Isn't that a little disproportional? And the answer is no, it's called war. War is about defeating your enemy or minimally putting them in a position where they come to terms on your terms. That's the punishment versus war element. Just a few words on the idea of going too far. Is a greatly misunderstood term that's used in American media and by the so-called experts who don't really know very much, and that is the term of proportional and disproportional force. There is no actual concept of the use of proportional force. In other words, if they fire one missile at you, you are under no legal or moral obligation to fire only one back at them. There is no such thing. If they kill 1,200 Israelis, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to stop at 1,200 and say, well, all right, we're even now. 1,200 of them, 1,200 of us, we're okay, everything's covered. That's not how war works. And should also make the point, I think, at this stage, that the 70+ thousand number, which is a Hamas estimate, includes by their admission 50,000 of their terrorists who were killed by us. In other words, if you accept their numbers, yes.
Also, from my little research, includes 20,000 natural deaths that occur after 2.5 years,
Right.
A population of 2 million.
Correct.
Leaving
right.
Not
So the numbers, the numbers are all messed up. But if we take them just at face value, without and the miracle of no natural deaths in Gaza over 2 years, we are still left with the fact that twice as many combatants were killed as non-combatants by Hamas's own figures. This is astounding when the typical ratio of non-combatant to combatant deaths in the 21st century is 10 to 1. Here it's 1 to 2. And that brings us back to the idea of proportionality. Proportionality is one of the 2 key central factors in what is referred to as just war theory, which is the underpinning of international law of war. First and foremost, I'm going to ask you a trick question. What does international law say about killing civilians in battle?
I would suppose the following: don't try to do it, but it's bound to happen.
Okay, close, very good. It is not illegal to kill civilians or non-combatants in battle. It's illegal to do it with intent. And to phrase it slightly differently, the presence of non-combatants does not protect combatants. The presence of combatants endangers non-combatants.
Eliot, I think this is. I want to dovetail a point in here. It's my impression that a lot of Americans, Westerners, conceive of Gaza as those bad guy terrorists and the rest of the innocent population. And there's somehow a separation between the bad guys and everybody else. And in this correspondence with this gentleman, I had said the research showed that 79% of the Gazans supported Hamas's activities, and that they were many were instrumental in showing the terrorists, as they were themselves terrorists, where the party was, where the bomb shelters were, where the military base was. And so the notion of innocence to a population that voted in Hamas in 2006, that knew what their history was, I think is largely incorrect. I'm curious about your response.
First of all, I agree with you. I want to focus on one point that you sort of said in passing, which I think is the most important. And that is that the population voted in Hamas. And this is one of the great contrasts between Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah was not voted in by anybody. They are a rogue organization within the sovereign state of Lebanon. Now, that's a whole story in and of itself. We're not going to go into that now. Hamas was the power, the ruling power in Gaza from 2006 till today, for all intents and purposes. They were elected, number one. All public opinion polls showed and show today they would be reelected. And I'm going to add another point that this is an Eliot rule, and it applies to Iran as well. No regime rules a population for an extended period of time. I'm not talking about a few months, an extended period of time without at least the tacit support of a significant number, if not a majority, of that population. In other words, this idea that you've got this small group of a few tens of thousands of people, and they are ruling over a population of 2 million against the will of the 2 million is simply false.
And yet,
Okay?
unfortunately, via media or via lack of experience or via idealism or cultural belief that there has to be goodness and happiness amongst populations all the time, that's the American view.
Yes, there's another American view, and we've digressed a bit, but I think it's an important digression. There's an important American view that actually goes back quite a while, but it's become more and more dangerous in its formulation, and that's what I call the over-personalization of the enemy. In other words, Saddam Hussein was the problem in Iraq. Bin Laden was the problem with Al-Qaeda. The Ayatollah is the problem in Iran. Nasrallah was the problem with Hezbollah, etc., etc., etc. Maduro was the problem in Venezuela. The people, like everybody else, was okay. There's this one person who's holding it all with an iron fist, and when you remove that person, everything's going to be fine. And of course, the greatest error in practice of that was Iraq, 2003. And the idea that by simply removing Saddam Hussein, democracy, which was the natural growth wish of the population, was going to spontaneously generate itself up through the sands of Iraq, and it didn't happen that way. So this idea that an individual rules, and you can go back to really individual rulers like Hitler, who drew all of Germany's power into and under himself, he was still supported by the institutions of Germany. It wasn't just Hitler, and it wasn't just the Nazi Party. And here, the same thing. Hamas had its institutions, has its institutions, and they're not all military. It rules Gaza, and the population goes along with it. Now, I'm going to say this one more time. Initially, yes, there's always that, okay, there's a new takeover. Let's see what's going to happen. They're in power. But to have no organized opposition over 2 decades means tacit support. That's what we're seeing in Gaza, in addition to all the points that you made, which are correct, that they got a great deal of support from the population. Look, we saw the videos of them bringing Hamas bringing the hostages back into Gaza, and the crowds out there cheering. Hostages who testified that Hamas had to protect them from the mobs on the street. There was no resistance to this. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day here in Israel. There were Germans who protected Jews. Not all that many, but there were. There were other Europeans who protected Jews. Not that many, but there were. There was not one single documented case in Gaza of a Gazan helping a hostage. That tells us something. And nobody can convince me that Hamas is any more brutal than the Nazis were. So, yes, there's all of that is going on. I want to come back, sort of loop back from our digression to what I started to say about just war theory, and it won't take very long. It's a very complicated theory that boils down to 2 very simple points. Or 3 points. You are not permitted to intentionally target non-combatants. By the way, I use the word non-combatants because Hamas are not soldiers. So to use civilian and military is an inappropriate categorization. So combatant, non-combatants, with all the problematics. However, if there's a legitimate military target, military in the sense of combatant target, with non-combatants in the area, you are obligated to do 2 things. They're both interesting and maybe worth a whole other conversation. One is called discrimination. In other words, you must do everything you can to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. In regular warfare, that's much easier. Combatants wear uniforms. Non-combatants don't wear uniforms. Here, it's a little bit more of a mishmash and it's more problematic. But still, the idea is if it's clear that it's a non-combatant, you are not to make a target out of it. However, they still might be affected by what's a term that I hate, collateral damage. You bomb a target and there are non-combatants there. And here's where proportionality comes in. What proportionality says is that the number of civilians, non-combatants, endangered by a military action must be in some way proportionate to the value of the target being struck by the military action. Now, that's an impossible calculus. It's a guideline. It has no practical legal way of application. In other words, how do I measure the value of a military target against the lives of non-combatants? What it basically says is you have to think about it. You have to ask yourself, am I endangering a disproportionate number of civilians for the gain that I will have from striking this particular target? That's what proportionality is, and not how much violence I use in my strike.
Just to add, it's my understanding that Hamas used hospitals, schools, civilian places and civilian apartment buildings to place their combatants and combatant activities, making
Correct.
the job much harder, I imagine.
Yes and no. Making it harder on the level of morality. When we went into some of the hospitals, We went in with medical teams, knowing that we were going to be disrupting medical services because Hamas was using the hospitals, and in particular hospitals, because the schools were simply buildings. There was no school in session. Okay. And the mosques, once again, mosques are not regularly populated structures, but hospitals are. And we went in with medical teams knowing that we were going to disrupt them because they were using the hospitals as fortified positions, firing positions, warehouses. They had headquarters in tunnels under the hospitals. Why did they do it? For obvious reasons. Knowing that first we would pause, and second, if we did it, we'd get nothing but bad press as a result of it. And that's exactly what happened under all the circumstances. There was one very interesting case at Shifa Hospital. I'm not talking about the false case of the jihad rocket that fell into the parking lot of the hospital. We were blamed. Leave that. Shifa Hospital, we occupied for a couple of weeks, and at the end of it, there was a report that X number of people had died while we were there in the hospital, implying that it was our being there that caused them to die. My mother-in-law, who's a very senior nurse, something just blew up in my backyard, it sounds like, said, well, how many people do you think die in a hospital over 2 weeks? We're having sirens. I don't know if you can hear the Iron Dome in the background. So I think we can end here because I'm going to go into a safe room. It's been a pleasure as always, and we'll pick this up again.
Stay safe. Make contact.
And
Bye-bye.
to all our
Thank you.
listeners. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.